Next up, we have Shamubeel Eaqub. Shamubeel is, arguably New Zealand's most well-known economist, with his focus on making economics easy to understand, and his penchant for memorable one-liners such as "tax is love," or calling Wanganui a zombie town. And Wanganui said, "Come here and say that," and he did. Very interesting town hall meeting that was. He's also an author, media commentator and thought-leading public speaker. He has over a decade of experience as an economist in Wellington, Melbourne, Auckland, and in leading international banks and consultancy. And as I'm sure you'll agree, moving to a circular economy will be a massive shift. And he'll be helping us to explore the economic path to that change. A huge round of applause for Shamubeel.
Thank you. I was quite disappointed I didn't get the memo about being dressed in all white. It's a hard act to follow, though. How do you make an economist interesting? I won't try. In my bio, I say over a decade, but really it's more like 2 decades. I'm getting a bit old now. The issue of the circular economy is something that I've spoken to Wasteman's conference, I think 3 years ago. Paul, remind me, I think it was 3 years ago. And the reason why I'm so interested in this is because it's about changing the narrative from how we do things now to something that is actually going to be sustainable, rather than the greenwashing that we do in terms of what we talk about sustainability now, to being something truly regenerative. But the frustration is that so much of what we have seen with sustainability has been about the people like you who are trying to do good, individually and within our small groups, which is nice, but it's not very effective. If we want real change, we have to change the way we do things. And that leadership ultimately has to come from our political leaders. The reality is, until we change our economic systems, our political systems, and our narrative, things are not going to move. And that's what Aotearoa talked about, right? It's about changing the narrative. We have to all believe that we want something different, and if that is not the case, then we're not going to get different outcomes. Because what we will find is whatever change we make is not enduring. And if you don't get enduring change, these multi-generational problems will not be fixed. Now, for those of you who are getting a little bit tired, this is what I'm going to talk about. If I think about our political economic system, I view it as something that is extraordinarily short-term. We're all about how do we win the next poll, not even the next election. It's about next week's political poll. How do we stay high enough that legitimizes our position in power? We have become increasingly selfish. We say lots of nice things about how we care about other people, but when push comes to shove, we look after ourselves. And so much of the decisions that we have made over the course of the last 30 years, more 40 years in my lifetime, I would say has been less about future generations and more about the current generation. This is a departure from the infrastructure, both social and physical, that we enjoy today, which was built off the back of sacrifices and investments made by the greatest generation. The reality is that generations that have followed after that have been leeches, and we are the problem. We should value and measure the right things. And we have become really obsessed with measuring things with extreme accuracy that don't mean very much. We have revisions to national accounts every few years, and apparently our economy is bigger than it has ever been. Isn't it wonderful that we brought financial services and financial intermediation into GDP, and it looks like we are all rich? But I don't know about you. I don't feel any richer. Our beaches aren't any cleaner. Our water's not any cleaner. Our air's not any cleaner. The narrative has been that if we have economic growth, we're going to get better outcomes for more people. That was the reason why we measured economic growth. And yet, we're now focused on only creating economic growth and forgotten the purpose, which is about making more people better off. And for so long, we have priced and valued all the things that we care about, and we have not priced and not valued all the things that are costs on others and costs on future generations. Whether it's pollution, whether it's water, whether it's air, whether it's waste, these are all too cheap. We all fill up our waste bins during the week. That is too much. It's too much, but it's so cheap. Why wouldn't you? Do you even think about it when you fill up your rubbish bin? Most of us don't. Some of you do because you care, but you're unusual. Not in a bad way, right? The thing is, we can change, and I've been amazed at the reception that we had to the announcement to banning of plastic bags. It was kind of like, yeah, of course we're going to do that, right? I mean, it was extraordinary to see the shift in the narrative from 10 years ago where, of course, we must all need it because otherwise I can't get the cat poo out of the cat litter, right? What the hell is wrong with these people? To kind of like, well, actually, the narrative has moved. Of course we're going to do it. We'll find ways of fixing it. So yes, the leadership from consumers and businesses can help, but it's not enough on its own. We have to magnify these stories so that they become part of our narrative. And if we can't change that narrative, nothing can change. But if you're going to make durable change, and I'm going to show you some pictures later that shows that we can make successful change that doesn't last. That is our history. So it is entirely possible to fix things and then completely bugger it up again in a future generation. So durable government policy is absolutely critical. And when you think about it, it all boils down to politics. Our big power, our big influence has to be about our political influence. Our role as citizens, as active participants in asking for change, demanding change, and holding our political leaders to account is where we're going to get the biggest and most sustainable traction. Anything else is not going to be good enough. Nothing else is going to give us the answer. I'll give you a little bit of backdrop because I have a habit of doing a little bit of wrist-lashing stuff. I'm quite depressing. So I want to start with a little bit of good news, but then get into the bad stuff because I think that suits my personality better. This is a chart that I use all the time, only because I think there is an element of amazing success that humanity has been able to deliver. 300 years ago, we had 90% of the world's population living in absolute poverty. Today, it's less than 10%. You cannot underestimate the progress that we have made. The human ingenuity is extraordinary. The things that we can do, the things that we can achieve is absolutely within our reach. The question is, what is it that we want to achieve? What is it that we value? What is it that we want to maximize? And the world is getting better. It's easy to be really negative and say everything is going to hell in a handbasket. That's not true. Even in New Zealand, we've got so much good stuff going on, but I know we can do better. And it's this definition of better, the vision of better, the narrative of better that we have to work harder on. We have taken care of lots of things, but there are also many things that we haven't taken care of. And that is where we have to focus our attention because we must always look to get even better. And this incredible economic progress is recent. I think this is something that we don't understand. When we talk about economic growth, we talk about it as if it's a God-given right that we must all enjoy extraordinary economic growth in our lifetimes, right? But when you look at the history of humanity, this is actually very recent. If you look at the last 2,000 years, there was almost no progress in terms of economic activity. GDP per capita was pretty much stagnant. This was the Malthusian trap, where we simply didn't have the technology, we didn't have the food, we simply couldn't break out of subsistence. And then something happened. We had the technological revolution, and we saw incredible unleashing of economic growth, economic prosperity, falls in poverty, falls in premature deaths from preventable diseases, all those kinds of things. So we've had some amazing successes, but also let's not forget that this kind of economic growth is actually very unusual in the history of humanity. We should not assume that growth for the sake of growth is the only thing that will make us better off. And we should also know that this has happened with consequences. This economic growth hasn't been free. When you think about the impact that it has on the environment, on our planet, on our society, it has some real serious consequences. In this particular snapshot, if you look at the level of CO2 in our atmosphere, it coincides with when we had that massive unleashing of economic growth. And that's not surprising because we started digging up resources from the ground in ways that we had never done before. We started burning stuff in ways that we had never done before. We started consuming more and more in a way that we had never done before. Our economy is fundamentally different now than it was 300 or 400 years ago. This is the cost of this economic growth that we've had, and this is one part that we have steadfastly refused to measure and steadfastly refused to address. And I see Rod there, and in your book you talk about the Anthropocene, right? All about how we're living beyond the Earth's means. That is exactly what we're doing. We're eating up the planet. And yet we talk about economic growth as if that is the only way to create prosperity. It is the only way to create progress. We have to start thinking a little bit wider, because the reality is that consuming more burgers and consuming more meat and consuming more TVs is not going to make us happier. I don't know about you, but the thrill of the new TV wears up pretty bloody quick. My last TV I bought a small TV because nobody watches it in our house. There's a different problem that Aotearoa talked about. Everybody's addicted to their smart devices, right? So let's not talk about that today. But this environmental consequence, I think, is the backdrop of why we're here today, in terms of how do we make sure that we're not talking about just one part, one symptom of economic progress, but the wider, full story of economic growth. One thing that I think we have really lost sight of is economic growth, economic success, as something that is for me versus something that is for my children and my grandchildren. The intergenerational view of success, the intergenerational view of investments is missing. Now, I talk about housing a lot only because it's an area that I know a reasonable amount, but that is a good example of where we made some serious investments in past generations that had real results. So if you look at the left-hand chart, around the time of the war, we had very low home ownership rates. And then the greatest generation essentially made this conscious decision that they wanted to have more home ownership. They wanted to have more homes. They wanted to have better quality homes for New Zealanders. And for generations, we saw that improvement. The home ownership rate in New Zealand increased pretty much from the 1930s until a peak in 1991. And since then, it's been falling. We've essentially created a new generation, the Generation Rent, who are not going to enjoy the same successes as their parents or their grandparents. There'll be lots of other things. We've got lots of junk, right? I mean, we've got our addiction to our smartphones, but we don't have our homes to live in. And so this is one of the arguments that I get a lot from baby boomers in particular. Sorry to all the baby boomers here. But this is one of the arguments that, but you guys are materially so much better off. Why are you bitching about not having your own home? Well, because shelter is a human right. Right? That is the reason. We're not meeting basic needs, but we're meeting a lot of frivolous needs. That is the structure of our economy now, that we can't provide the basics, but we can give you the luxuries. Isn't that wonderful? There's something not quite right. But not only that, we know that this idea that we make every generation that comes better off than the one that has come before it, that's been failing. I do not believe that my children will inherit a world that is going to be better than the one that I came into. Even in the world of work, if you look at the lifetime incomes that you can expect, that has been falling pretty much since those who were born in the 1980s. I'm lucky that I was born in 1980. So I was kind of at the peak of the lifetime income expectation, right? Every generation that was born pretty much from the 1950s until 1980s could have expected to earn more than their parents, which is what you expect, right? That is what you want. You want to give more economic opportunities for your children and for future generations. And yet, for children who have been born after the 1980s, they're likely to earn less over their lifetimes than the generation before. The reason I tell you this is because we accept that our children are going to be worse off than we are. This is a conscious decision that we have made as citizens of New Zealand. The politics, the economic policies, the social norms, this is what we accept. You may not individually, but as a collective, that is what we have voted for. And that is the result of where we are today. So if you want to make change, we have to shift what we want, and that is really difficult. But also, I would argue that we have become a less empathetic, and a more selfish country. Certainly in the evidence that I see of what we have done, we have become less empathetic. For me, state housing in New Zealand is one of those policies that is a great success. It's a great success in that we know that there will be vulnerable parts of society who need help to get the basics of shelter over their heads. And that was the reason why we built state houses in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s. But if you look at the chart on the left-hand side, our housing stock, state housing stock, rose through that period. And really, we haven't built a hell of a lot since then. If anything, today, we have less state housing today than we did in 1991. And our population has grown by more than 50%. We have consciously decided that the poor and vulnerable in New Zealand do not deserve a roof over their head. That is what we have decided. That is the economic policies and the politics of our country. We choose to have a tax cut. We choose to have more money spent on us rather than on the poor and vulnerable. Right? And this matters because it shows you what kind of economics and politics we live by. This is the reality of our politics of the last 40 years. We have chosen to be selfish. We have chosen not to be empathetic. You look at our prison population, it's in the headlines now. This goes back to the 1980s. Look at the rate of imprisonment in New Zealand today. Don't tell me that we're an empathetic, altruistic society. We're not. We know that imprisonment doesn't work. In what other business would you be allowed to have the kinds of failures that we have in the prison system where you come out and you commit another crime? And yet, we persist with the same kind of policies that we have. The reason I'm telling you this is because it's a wider picture of what kind of philosophy we project into our politics and in our policies. And that projection is very much one of a lack of empathy and selfishness. I use the word love a lot in my talks because I think ultimately that is what's missing. Empathy is too clinical in some ways. That's what you expect an economist to say. Love is something that economists don't talk about, right? Because we're not human beings, right? But the reason I say that is because if you think about love, it takes away a lot of the constraints in terms of what you can value, what you can optimize, what you can maximize. It gives you an ability to do things that you wouldn't otherwise do. And I think we all know this from when we do things for our kids, for example. You get joy from just seeing them succeed, not because you get anything in return. And in fact, that is what's missing. When you think about looking after the poor and vulnerable, those who don't have a voice, you shouldn't want anything in return. You should want to do it because you just want it. That's what love is. And yet I think that is what is missing in the economic and political system that we have. When I think about the fix, and there is no easy fix. We know this, right? This is the reason why we're here. This is the reason why we know there are lots of difficulties, is we value the wrong things. I think we have become more selfish. I don't think we see each other very much. I don't think we understand the problems and the pains of society. And nor do we feel like it's our responsibility. We measure the wrong things, and we don't enforce the things that we say we value. So there's so many failures that are all wrapped up into where we are that it makes it very difficult to change things. Aotearoa talked about how we, in some ways, celebrate natural disasters, right? You recall when we had the Canterbury earthquakes, the first reaction was, oh, it's going to be great for GDP. Well, fuck me, right? It's just razed a city. People died. And people are still suffering in that city. But if you look at the GDP of Canterbury, it was wonderful for the city. There is something not right when the thing that really is your guiding principle, at least in terms of economic measure, doesn't measure destruction, doesn't measure loss, doesn't measure all those things that are absolutely real, and yet we just choose to ignore all of that, and all we measure is the cleanup and the rebuild. This is what we keep doing. We keep thinking about our economy in a way that tells us that somehow we should be grateful that we have raised a city. Something is not right when your fundamental measure of economic success is so fundamentally flawed. Now, there's a lot of bitching about the living standards framework or whatever it is that other people use. The OECD has been using something like this for a while. But the reality is that anything that is less one-dimensional than GDP is a good thing. It's not perfect, but hell, it's a hell of a lot better than not measuring anything else. For too long, we've kind of just gone along and said, it's okay because as long as the economy is growing, the rising tide would lift everybody. That's a complete fallacy. Of course, that's not true. And yet we keep saying this to each other because it makes us feel good somehow, that it's okay, that we've got economic growth, so we should be able to sort stuff out. It's completely wrong. It's not enough on its own. Economic growth gives us options, but it can also be destructive. We might be rewarding behavior that is actually not very good. We price many things, right? Whether it's, if you go to a price comparison site, you know exactly how much your coffee is going to cost or what the supermarket is going to charge you for something. But do we really know how much we should be pricing water? Do we really know how much we should be pricing waste? Do we really know how we should be pricing water, air quality? Well, the answer is no. When it comes to that kind of stuff, it's really hard. Or you must have bunches of consultants, and they will all disagree with each other because they're economists. We're very good at that, in disagreeing with each other. For every argument, there is a counter-argument available from a paid economist. When it comes to externalities, there is so much that is in our favor, in our incentive system, to not count the costs, the true costs of pollution. And there's a huge amount of political power that stops us from talking about these things. When I kind of look at what we do as an economy, what we do as society, what we do with our policies, what I see is that we say a lot of things about what we value, that we're egalitarian, that we love clean, green New Zealand, that we love all of these kinds of things. But when it comes to actions, we shy away. There is a disconnect between what we say and what we do. And that disconnect is not going to be resolved by just saying the government should do something, because the government can do some things, but they will ultimately be beholden to us, the voters. I think we're not valuing the right things. I don't think we value future generations. I don't think we truly value our environment. I don't think we truly value fairness in our society. That is the reason why we have chosen to have the kinds of policies and the kinds of actions of the last 40 years. It is our fault. It is our collective responsibility to change this. And when push comes to shove, because it's human nature, right? I mean, think about psychology, think about behavioral economics, we know this to be true. When it comes to the point of a decision to be made, we choose the status quo. Inertia is an extraordinarily powerful force. We choose to keep things as they are because it's really hard to make change. And it's just easier. The path of least resistance is to just let things happen as they are. When push comes to shove, we look after ourselves, right? When it comes to all the polls, political polls, everybody tells us, yes, we don't like inequality, but also we don't want to pay any more tax. And also we don't want any more redistribution. Well, something doesn't add up, guys. You can't value all those things equally. And when it comes to how we vote, how we choose what policies that we like, ultimately we prioritize us. And the reason for that is we prioritize the current much more than the future. And we know this to be true in all decision making, that whether it comes to retirement savings, environmental policy, whatever, the future's too hard, it's too far away. That has a very high discount rate in our mind, right? It's because we don't understand the future, we can't see it, it has less value. Not true for everybody, but for the large parts of our population, when it comes to the unconscious way that we think, we don't value the future. And that is why we make the decisions that we make, because we are prone to these kinds of mistakes if we're not thinking about things consciously. When I think about the problems that we face, whether it's around this issue of the circular economy, what it's trying to resolve, ultimately when you kind of boil it all down, what we're missing, or the problem that we're facing is a failure of coordination. Is how do we work with each other? How do we get all our values and our actions and our policies aligned in a way that's going to work? And economics is a big body of literature in terms of how you solve coordination problems. But the coordination problem that's difficult to solve is when your values are not aligned. Right? If you don't share the same values, it's really difficult for you to work together because you want something, he wants something else. So it's very hard for you guys to get together and say, actually, we're going to cooperate. More likely, you're going to say, well, screw you. I'm going to look after me. You look after you. And if I'm more powerful, I'm going to win. Right? It becomes a power play. And when you think about the solutions that you have to get, it's about aligning those objectives and facilitating cooperation. So if you can have those aligned objectives. So when I think about the plastic bag announcement, I think what was interesting for me was the social norm had changed by the time the announcement came. That was the difference, right? People had already expected it, but most people were like, yeah, whatever, of course it's fine. But to me, that was extraordinarily interesting and really telling in terms of the behavior of society, that by the time we were accepting of this change, we were expecting this change. So when the announcement came, it had very little resistance. The social norm had shifted. That is what we're talking about. When you're talking about a regenerative economy, when you're talking about the sustainability movement, what we're trying to change is social norms. But that is hard to do, right? So for example, in one space that I've been working really hard is around housing and renting in particular, how do you make renting better? But boy, it's hard work, right? Every time you have a story about how renting conditions suck and we should make them better, there is a comment from the Investors Federation that says, oh, it'll be terrible because rents will go up. That's the answer for everything, to be honest. It'll make all the landlords poor and it'll make them bankrupt. You can't possibly have any more rules. But essentially, there's a lot of resistance to change. And when you're trying to change the behavior and the narrative, it is a really difficult, a really unwieldy thing. If you want to lead it, if you want to fast track it, which is I think what we want to do, I think what we have to do is we have to enforce cooperation and change in behavior. And when I mean enforce, I mean rules and regulations. This is not about you and me being good, conscious decision makers, but about actually having some minimum standards that you can't go below, that you must not make any more pollution than this much, that you must not kill fish in our rivers, that you must not poison our lands. Those are the absolute minimums that government can and should do. But not only should they do that, the thing that we fail at is enforcing our rules and regulations. We have plenty of rules and regulations. The question is, are we enforcing them to a standard that changes behavior? I'd argue that we're not, and that is where we have to make the big shift. I'll go back to the story of housing only because I think it's a good way to show you how leadership from government can help. When it came to house building, essentially the greatest generation made a very conscious decision that they're going to invest in infrastructure and housing with a whole bunch of policies around actually buying up land, supporting developers, capitalizing the family benefit, giving access to discounted mortgages, all those kinds of things. But essentially, if you look at that decade from the 1950s to the 1970s, we built a hell of a lot of houses relative to the population of New Zealand. As soon as those policies went away, we started to build just what we were building before that. And New Zealand is not alone in that. The UK has exactly the same experience. When the local authorities stepped out of housing supply, the private sector continued to build exactly as it was before. What went missing was that affordable housing for poor and vulnerable folk. There is a role for government because there are certain parts of the economy that will never ever be met by the private sector unless there is direct intervention by government. And this is why I say leadership from government is critical. Because of the lack of government leadership for the last 40 years, I reckon New Zealand is short by about, well, we didn't build roughly 480,000 houses in the last 40 years. I mean, the number is just mind-blowing. But that is the neglect that we have imposed on our society. When I think about what you and I can do, a lot of it is about being good citizens, about valuing the right things. All of those things are helpful, but we can't make other people do things. Our influence and our power is limited, and that makes it very difficult. That is the role of government. But at the same time, I want to warn you that government policy is not always enduring. When I look at the picture of inequality, for example, in New Zealand, we had great success through that investment period by the greatest generation of bringing down income inequality. And it was sustained pretty much until the 1980s. And then we changed our economic policies and inequality popped up. We've had 40 years of economic growth and absolutely no improvement in income inequality. The reason I tell you that is because good economic policies can be undone very, very quickly. And it is not about a political party. We've had plenty of political parties in that period of income inequality, and nobody has been able to change the consensus economic story. The narrative in New Zealand is very much one that is stuck in the 1980s. And this matters for us. When we want to influence and when we want to make change, we have to understand that these narratives are long-lived, and their consequences are long-lived, and they're difficult to change. How do we create a vision that is shared and that is enduring? How do we create actions that will not be undone by successive changes in government? I don't know the answer to these things. I don't know because our experience of the last 40 years is that we are not good at doing this. The answer from the last 40 years is that we are bad at doing this. The answer from the last 100 years is that when you have leadership and change in the narrative, it is easy to do, and you can get real gains over periods of 50, 60, 70 years. So there is hope, but let's not pretend it's easy. The lessons from history, certainly the recent history, is that it's bloody hard to make change. Lessons from longer history is that we need a big shock. We need a big kick up our backside to wake us up and start doing things differently. But it has to come with leadership from a generation. And that is our big challenge. That is where we have to go. How many of you in this room expected Brexit to happen? One taker. Two. Usually it's only one in any room that asks this question. And the reason I ask about Brexit is because look at how durable that vote has been, right? The majority of voters wanted Brexit at the time they had the referendum, but now there's a lot of disillusionment, right? So political consensus, at least at the vote, at the poll, can move around very, very quickly. But what was interesting for me in terms of what happened during the Brexit vote was what it told us about the political power of essentially the disempowered, those who felt angry and left behind. And essentially it was people who were older, people who had less education, people who lived in the provinces. These were the people who really wanted to leave Europe because they couldn't see how they benefited from the integration of the last 30 to 40 years. For us, I think the relevance is that even in our society, we're seeing the same kind of balkanization, the same kind of divisions in terms of whether it's across incomes, in terms of job opportunities, in terms of environmental concerns, whatever it might be. We're seeing these deep divisions that are being shown up across different parts of society. And that is where we have to fight our trench wars. What we have to do is recruit enough people who want change for the better, who want a political system and an economic system that is regenerative, not simply linear, not simply about consumption, not simply about counting up the things that we do and not the things that we lose. This is a big ask, but what we're talking about is a Nigel Farage type narrative that this is a simplified version of this is what sustainability means. This is about the survival of your mokopuna. This is what we're talking about. It's good for us, it's good for society, good for the future, but it requires some upfront investment. That is the biggest barrier to change. It's this upfront investment that nobody wants to make. What can I tell you? I think we are trapped in the status quo right now, but I'm seeing some really encouraging signs that things are shifting. But don't be complacent. Don't be complacent because our current economic and political system is very short-term. It is selfish. It has no room for future generations. But we're seeing chinks in the armor of this story. We're starting to see people, younger generations in particular, talk a lot more about not just economic growth, because let's face it, they're not going to get the benefits that previous generations did. But also, they have a wider worldview than perhaps my parents did. We're starting to value other things and measure the right things. This is good. We should support and absolutely expand these services. We have to make sure that we're not just counting up one part of the economy, because what you measure is what you're counted against. And right now, look at the narrative around, falling business confidence, isn't it terrible, government should do something about it. I'm sick of people just saying just government should do something about business confidence. Well, let the cycle do its thing. Government should be focused on structural economic policies. That's the job of government, not to fix whether or not you and I are feeling bad today. The difficulty also is we have so many incentives, so much tied up in terms of this rent-seeking behavior that we refuse to price externalities correctly. Our pollution is not priced right. Our waste is not priced right. We got to do those things much better. If we don't do that, if the signals are not there, if we can't show people the cost of your behavior, it is not possible to see real and enduring change in people's behavior. It's absolutely critical that we start to price externalities as accurately as possible. We can change, and I think there is a role for groups of people like us to think about and champion issues. Consumers and businesses can help, because this is where the grassroots movements begin. This is what starts to build that narrative that's going to work, because we don't know what narrative will grip the majority of the population. But we have to start somewhere, and that is our role. But there is no substitute for durable government policy. Unless government steps up and actually legislates and enforces good behavior, you will not get enduring change. And even then, we know that government policies and successes that we've had in the past can be undone by future generations, because we forget the lessons of history, because we forget how much sacrifice it took to get the successes that we enjoy today. Politics, in the end, holds the key to any major structural shift in the economy and in society. There is a big role for people like me in terms of telling the right stories to our politicians, to our policymakers, but ultimately what we have to shift is the dial on the public narrative. Without the public, we've got nothing. If we can't get the consensus that unthinkingly accepts that sustainability is a core part of what New Zealand stands for, you are not going to have durable government policy, you're not going to have durable change that's going to be delivering the kinds of things we want to deliver. So that is the challenge that I leave to you, is not that you should be slashing your wrists, although sometimes I do feel like that, but more that the challenge in front of us is big. There are absolute lessons from history that success is possible, but boy, it's a big hill, big mountain to climb. Thank you.
Shamubeel Eaqub, absolutely. I've got to say, I've done a couple of these things with Shamubeel, and it's always deeply inspiring whenever you talk. Is there any before we move on? Is there any questions from Slido at all? Anybody? If you can put them up here. Here's one. Shamubeel. Paul says, how do we get beyond that 3-year political cycle?
Well, I don't think we can get beyond that quickly. I think more importantly, we have to change that consensus of what different political parties want. So it doesn't become the flip-flop between my party wants this and the other party wants something else. We have to take that politicization out of some of these things. And we're seeing that on lots of different public policy areas where really, I don't know about you, but I see very little difference between our political parties. They're all much the same. They all suck, right?
Deborah asks, Shamubeel, do you have any thoughts on how economists can influence the economic model changes that you spoke of?
Well, I think economists have been doing a bit of that. So when you think about the living standards framework, that was led by Giraud at the Treasury. So there was an economist who was trying to lead that change. So a lot of that is about trying to lift the popular economic narrative that's more than about just GDP. In reality, in academia, we haven't thought about just GDP as a measure of success for a very long time. But it's simple, so we use that as a shorthand. And I think a lot of the role of experts is about how do we take that knowledge that's already inside academia and turn it into that is consumable and accepted by the public. So there is a big role for public to play, but unfortunately, I think the experts are being dethroned. I think people are resistant to experts. And that is really what we're seeing with Trump and Brexit, is the kind of rejection of experts and acceptance of common sense.
Who really drives change? So I'm just sort of referring to Dr. Michael Braungart's talk and the extraordinary examples he gave of some major organisations doing extraordinary things. Puma with compostable shoes, or Maersk, one of the world's largest logistics companies, really getting on board. I mean, that's where the real change happens, surely, not government.
Well, it is and it isn't, because you can get those really large organizations that can make meaningful change. But how do you affect the 90% of SMEs who don't have any time to think about anything other than doing their business? You've got to take that thinking away from those many unthinking business owners and say, this is just how we do things. You create a norm of doing things, and I think that's where it comes from. But the leadership absolutely comes from these visionary companies and visionary individuals that do things better.
Here's one. Steve asks, can you see carbon taxes coming in with the money raised? Where did it go?
Going to something.
Yeah, going to something. We'll forget about that one. Bruce says, would you endorse fees levied under legislation on all goods and materials at time of purchase and being made available to fund good recovery and disposal?
Absolutely. I think that's one of the big missing things, right? So I don't know about you guys, but I've got drawers full of used cell phones that nobody's going to use ever again, right? And e-waste, for example, is a really big problem because New Zealand doesn't have a good system for disposal and recycling.
They will soon over here.
Thank God for that. And about time, right? But this is an externality that is created every time we purchase a product, but that externality is not priced, and there is no infrastructure that goes with it. And this is kind of this, we cannot throw responsibility to the wind. Somebody will take care of it. You can't throw responsibility to the wind. There has to be an element of stewardship, that if you have created it, you have a responsibility to make sure that it is used responsibly and recycled and taken to its full and permanent use. And for a lot of the materials that's in our phones, they're completely recyclable and they're extraordinarily valuable. So rather than digging up the earth for more of these products, what they're doing in places like Japan is recycling a huge amount of these metals and minerals because it makes economic sense.
As Dr. Braungart was saying, a couple of quick ones here and then we'll move on. We're running a bit over, but these are very interesting. These are great questions, by the way. Steve says, could you see carbon taxes being legislated with money going to climate change versus the consolidated fund?
Yeah, that's a tricky question, right? So absolutely on the carbon tax, because carbon is underpriced in New Zealand, right? I mean, it's underpriced everywhere. This is why the cap and trade in Europe is not working very well. So you've got to price it really high, and you've got to make sure there's a floor. So there's a couple of technicalities in terms of how a cap and trade regime can work. But also the question is, where should that money go? Should it go to the general consolidated fund? The answer is absolutely no, because we know what will happen. It will become a political football. Given the task that's ahead of us in terms of education, technological innovation, in terms of diffusion, all of that kind of stuff, we have a huge task ahead of us. Any money raised by carbon should be directed towards carbon reduction initiatives.
All right, and just one more here. Andrew says, if we need to gather public support for these changes, what is the turtle with the plastic straw in its nose equivalent for the changes that you propose?
Yeah, see, this is the difficulty, right? As an economist, that's exactly what we're not good at. And this is why nobody listens to economists. I don't know what that catalyst is, and this is why I'm saying we have to start our own journeys, because as we tell these narratives, as we engage on our narratives and our successes, that's when we're going to discover the things that resonate. If I knew, we would have done it already, but we don't know. It's not easy. But I think that is exactly what we're looking for, is that we're looking for that narrative that just makes it simple, right? For people to have that one burning image in their mind that goes, of course we're not going to do it this way anymore. This is how we're going to do it. For each of us it might be different, but for social consciousness I think it needs something else, and I don't know what the answer is.
Just a final observation from me before we sort of move on, but I had a very interesting experience on the radio about 3 weeks ago. We had a panel on, got the sort of vibe, we had a panel on whether people would like to bring back milk bottles, because I can recall in my childhood, right? Like right now, hundreds of plastic bottles sent away from my house. But when I was growing up, seriously, for 15 years, we had 4 milk bottles. Yeah. 4 glass milk bottles for 15 years. And one day, one broke. You know, it was the biggest thing that happened in our household. Dad said, what the fuck did you do? You broke a milk bottle. It was a big deal. And I was just thinking that, and I put it on the radio, and in all the 5 years I've been in the show, I have never had such an enormous response than people clamouring to bring back glass milk bottles. It blew me away. It was extraordinary. But there was a very interesting undercurrent. They said, yes, we'd give anything to bring back reusable glass milk bottles, but it'll never happen because society's moved on. And there was a fatalism. They said, Fonterra or the likes, we can't do it now. We're in a new type of economic thinking. There was a real resignation of fatalism there. What are your thoughts? Can we go back to the future, or is that horse bolted?
No, I think we can, and it might have to be done differently than somebody coming around with a truck to deliver milk to your house, because we probably live different lives now. We don't do the 9 to 5 so much. People are dispersed, all those kinds of things. But swapper crates still work. I don't know about you, but I quite enjoy that for my beers. But it's this idea of recycling. It's that inconvenience. Are you willing to put up with a little bit of inconvenience to get that better outcome? But the narrative has to change, right? I think we have prioritized convenience over everything else. That's the reason. It's the same thing with the plastic bags. Who wants to take a bag with them? Well, it's not that hard, guys.
Mike Hosking does.
Good for him. Good for him. Well, so do I. And when I forget, it's like, oh man, I'm probably going to have to buy another one of those reusable bags, which is not so good. But I hear you. I think the fatalism comes from...
There was a strong sense of it.
I think because we feel helpless, because it feels like things are done to us rather than it's things that are for us. There's no agency when it comes to these kinds of things, except, of course, there is agency. If customers want something, then the businesses will provide. Businesses are not in the business of telling you how you should live your lives. They just want your money.
Yeah. Hey, huge round of applause to Shamubeel.
Thank you.
Fantastic. Really.